Good day to everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Policy Talk series of the Asian Development Bank's Southeast Asia Regional Department. Today, we will be focusing on transitioning to a low-carbon economy, what it will mean for Southeast Asia, what it will take to achieve that goal, what the various stakeholders are doing or planning. Many governments, international organizations, and NGOs have highlighted climate change as the pressing economic and social issue of our time. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has called for substantially reducing emissions by 2030 in order to limit the global rise in temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The United Nations Environmental Program has estimated that the world needs to cut 30 gigatons annually of greenhouse gas emissions. The Asian Development Bank, for its part, has placed combating climate change and its consequences at the top of its development agenda. The bank is therefore scaling up support to address climate change, disaster risks, and environmental degradation, elevating its ambition of $100 billion in cumulative climate financing from its own resources to developing member countries for the period 2019 to 2030. The bank supports policies, practices, and technologies that lower greenhouse gas emissions and is mainstreaming a comprehensive approach to climate and disaster resilience. ADB is promoting climate and disaster resilience by investing in water supply, sanitation, irrigation, flood control, transport, and energy infrastructure. The bank works with its developing member countries to build resilience to climate change impacts and disasters. Investment in climate and disaster resilience can contribute to sustained growth, poverty reduction, and enhanced natural resources management. ADB is also engaged across Asia and the Pacific in supporting sustainable forest management and conservation efforts. In Southeast Asia, ADB is working with the governments of Indonesia and the Philippines in introducing the Energy Transition Mechanism. The ETM aims to retire coal power plants early and has the potential to be the largest carbon reduction model in the world. We have today a group of experts to discuss the implications of decarbonization for the Southeast Asian region. Lorraine Elliott is Professor Emerita at the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs in the Australian National University. She has been a member of the Scientific Steering Committee of the Earth System Governance Research Network and an expert reviewer for the IPCC Working Group 3 report and for the UNEP's Global Environmental Outlook. Carlo Napanda is the Southeast Asia Engagement Lead for Energy and Climate at the World Resources Institute. He was previously Managing Director for the Philippines of Allotrope Partners, a clean energy investment and advisory service based in San Francisco. Grace Tian, Senior Economist at the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department of the ADB. She leads the team that produces ADB's Asian Bond Monitor and the Asian Bonds Online platform. She also leads the team that will produce the forthcoming Asian Development Outlook 2023's theme chapters on understanding opportunities and challenges faced by developing Asia during the low carbon transition. She was previously Associate Professor at Fudan University. Naida Morgado is an infrastructure specialist at the Southeast Asia Innovation Hub of the ADB. She designs innovative financing instruments for climate-related infrastructure projects and is leading the development of the Green Recovery Platform. She previously worked at the OECD Development Cooperation Center. David Dovan is a senior investment specialist at the Private Sector Operations Department of the ADB. He previously worked at Societe Generale, Mizuho Bank, and ABN AMRO, covering infrastructure in the Asia Pacific. Some house rules. Please keep your audio and video off at all times. You may submit questions by stating your name, affiliation, the question, and for whom the question is for. You may also raise your hands during the Q&A portion. So let's start with our discussion. For Marlon and Grace, what would a low-carbon Southeast Asia look like? What measures would it require to get to that future? And what are the costs and the opportunities? Shall we start with you, Grace?
Yep. Thanks, Harry. This question is actually very broad, so maybe I will focus on the from a macroeconomic perspective, the opportunities and challenges that faced, well, maybe more general for the entire developing Asia, and then which is also may largely apply to Southeast Asia. So general, if we try to understand the nature of this low carbon transition, is we cannot rely on the carbon prices as it is now, because we need to consider the externality of emissions and then the potential climate-related risk it brings to us. So this naturally will pose a very, very important question. So when we face a higher carbon price in different forms, so what means for macroeconomic? So what does it mean for households, for business, and then from the entire economy? So I think that is the question we wanted to see. And then based on this, what we can see now is for many of the current facilities, I mean the producers in Asia, so when they used to emit more, and then I mean they naturally face a higher production costs, well, from the energy, also from the production logistics, every perspective. And then at the same time, we also face a possible change in the market. So this not only comes from the regulation perspective, also from the market itself. So there are regulation changes, there are behavior changes. So from the supply side and demand side, we will see different changes towards the price and consumption, and then the usage of carbon-related energy. That's for sure. And then in terms of how to make it happen, I would say, I mean, technology might be the most important factor that we need to make it happen in a less painful way, more smooth way, and in a timely way. So if we wanted to discuss opportunities it brings, of course, we see the pains, we see the costs, but if we see the opportunities, basically, if we can successfully, I mean, smoothly transit to a low carbon growth model, and then for sure, we will see some input, more input effects. This can, okay, for example, we will see more physical capital inputs because we sort of mitigate potential damage from the climate change. We could also see more maybe natural capital because of course, similar, we do a better job in mitigating the climate change. And then we can also possibly see some more capital, human capital inputs because, okay, well, we do a better job in terms of the environment. So we will definitely have more inputs. And then at the same time, we can also see more efficiency. So for example, energy efficiency, we burn less, but we achieve the same output. And then innovation is also another drive that we can see in terms of transitioning towards low carbon, particularly on those low carbon solutions. So these can all contribute to growth. And then at the same time, we can also see social benefits, social welfare, more jobs. We can gain resilience. I mean, energy resilience, maybe food resilience, and then of course there are also health and health benefits, environmental benefits. So in general, we see a lot of opportunities that can be delivered by the low carbon transition. But of course, we still need to understand. I mean, it is a painful and costly transition. Particularly, we need more money to make it happen. There are high, well, front-loaded effects in terms of replacing the existing the facilities. We need to also adjust for the new demands in the markets, adjust for the regulations, and then we also need to train our current workforce. We will lose some efficiency because we need to get to learn this new technology or to adapt to them. So we need or some jobs might be lost, but some jobs can be created, some workforce can be retrained. So all this needs some funding. And that is one thing. And then at the same time, we also face a lot of, I mean, institutional challenges. I mean, there are resistance, inconsistency in the strategies, how far we go, how fast we go, and then who should bear more, how to allocate the costs. So there are still a lot of uncertainties on the way to it, and then this definitely will affect how far we will achieve it. So this is all on that end. And then there are a lot of uncertainties on the international on the innovation end too. So far, even many of the renewable energy solution is already substantially lowering the cost of renewable energy, but the supply, I mean, renewable supply is still limited. So the most promising one is still maybe hydro, and maybe even nuclear can bring some potential. So to the extent we rely on wind, even solar, it's still relatively small. So how can we leverage that more, and then how to apply those at a relatively cheap costs? Is all a lot of uncertainties on that. And then on top of that, we also face the capacity to rolling them out. Yeah. So and then we face the resource constraints on those too. So that is how we see the picture is mixed, and then it's really, I mean, all the efforts is needed to address this. I would like to hand over to Martin. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, Chan. Thanks, Henry, for the question. So I'll focus on the energy aspect of the low carbon transition because in Southeast Asia, the emissions are dominated by the energy and transport sectors. So this low carbon transition is an opportunity for us, is a generational opportunity for us to transform our systems from one that's heavily fossil-based, that's analog and centralized. That's what we have currently right now, which is what has powered our economy to date. Something that's fossil heavy, analog compared to being digital, centralized compared to being decentralized. So this low carbon transition is an opportunity for us to shift from fossil heavy to something that's renewables based, analog into something that's digital, and from centralized into something that's decentralized and more inclusive. And that means that the low carbon transition is a journey towards decarbonization, decentralization, and digitalization. And those can be measured by the shift that we have from from the current stock of energy and transport configuration that we have. Countries have already submitted their NDCs. A majority, except for the Philippines, of the ASEAN countries have also expressed net zero goals. So these could all be measured, and the countries could be taken accountable to these NDCs and nationally determined contribution targets and net zero goals. So we can say that those could be our way to measure these. In terms of costs and opportunities, there will be, as mentioned earlier, regulatory changes and behavioral changes that would need to be done. But this is an opportunity for us to address systemic problems, ensure resilience of communities, and making sure that we are set towards prosperity rather than disaster in terms of the impending climate challenges. So I hope with that, that answers a bit of your question, Henry, and we could take that from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace and Marlon, for setting the stage for our discussion. Now we turn to Lorraine, Naida, and David. But before that, I would just like to note that both Marlon and Grace have noted the importance of new technologies and how it may take time for those new technologies to come up and be adopted and adapted. It reminds me of Paul David's paper on general purpose technologies about how when the world shifted from steam to electricity, the benefits didn't show up at once because it took time to restructure factories, lay cables, and so on. So I imagine it would be the same. For Lorraine, Naida, and David, what are the issues and challenges in transitioning to a low carbon economy, especially in the Southeast Asian context? What are the requirements and how are governments responding right now? But also more generally stakeholders, not just governments. Let's start with Lorraine.
Thank you. Thank you, Henry. Can you hear me? Am I clear?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I think that Grace and Marlon have both identified in a way some of the issues, and so perhaps I'll just pick up on a couple of those in my comments. The first is, I think, to observe again, as they've noted, that transitions to low carbon growth have to be environmentally sustainable. They have to be resource efficient, and they have to be socially equitable in practice, and they have to deliver sustainability, efficiency, equity, and social inclusion in their outcomes. That has to be, that's the core of green growth and transitions to a low carbon economy. One of the challenges is that clear transition pathways in Southeast Asia are not yet well defined. There are systemic and structural challenges, and there are sectoral challenges. Generally, overall, there's still an uneven capacity for mainstreaming green economy approaches, including nature-based solutions, into all relevant areas of policy making. There are financial and investment challenges, and I think we're going to come back to talk about those a little bit later. And Henry's already identified the kinds of sums that are estimated to be required, and some studies suggest that we've only seen about 1% of that. $1 trillion. The incentives to help scale decarbonisation approaches are probably inefficient at the moment. There are sectoral challenges, and I might say something a little bit about energy, picking up on Marlon's observations as well, and Henry's observation that the ASEAN member states have identified energy as crucial to addressing these long-term climate goals, but also to promote green growth, to boost post-COVID economies and ensure that those transitions are as sustainable and inclusive and just as well. There's still a very, very high level of emphasis on fossil fuels. Southeast Asia's reliance on fossil fuels to meet a rising demand for energy is going to be a significant vulnerability in today's energy crisis and in those transition pathways. About 75% of the growth in energy demand in Southeast Asia, say to 2030, is expected still to come from fossil fuels. That's a real challenge. To the extent that there is a focus on renewable energy, and there has been, as we know, it's skewed to hydropower and biofuels. There's much slower growth in wind and solar. Grace touched on the issue of job creation, and that's always been central to the notion of just transitions. It's going to require policy action in 3 key areas: support for and reskilling of workers who are currently employed in the fossil fuel energy sector, decent jobs in the renewable energy sector, and the creation of sustainable jobs in those sectors such as agriculture, for example, or transport, that are affected by energy transition. And job creation has both quantitative, that is how many jobs, but also qualitative dimensions. One of the big challenges in Southeast Asia is that any kind of job creation has to account for and overcome high levels of informal and vulnerable unemployment across all sectors, has to expand employment opportunities for women and for other groups that are marginalised in both formal and informal economies. There are going to be social and geographic challenges. ASEAN still has quite a high level of energy poverty, for example. Perhaps around 45 million people in the region don't have access to electricity or to reliable and affordable energy, but that's often in remote areas where efforts at rural electrification are going to be challenged. And there are environmental challenges. Large-scale solar farms, for example, can result in Indigenous land loss, forest and natural landscape clearing. Land prices in project areas can escalate, actually driving out smallholders, subsistence farmers, potentially having an impact on local food security. Wind energy, tidal barrages, as part of a green economy transition, can nevertheless affect coastal communities, land and sea territories, fishing grounds, and possibly impact coastal hydrology and fish movements. So there are a number of challenges there. Henry, perhaps I can throw this back to you now for the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lorraine, and thank you for noting the potentially unintended consequences, land prices, and the impact on fishermen. And we will get back to you on that later. Naida?
Thanks, Henry. Thanks very much. I wanted to pick up on I think where Lorraine kind of left off. So Lorraine outlines like the broader sort of sets of challenges that the region is facing. I think at a kind of macro level, there's a major misalignment. And to me, that's the kind of pervading challenge. So you have in 2021, all the countries in Southeast Asia committing to, stronger targets or recommitting to the targets they already have to reduce emissions. You have 8 out of 10 countries committing to net zero. You have long-term strategies being adopted. So that's 2021. In 2022, the IEA's recent energy outlook for Southeast Asia portrays a slightly different picture. So basically, we're looking at increased energy demand of 3% per year from now to 2030. We're looking at 3/4, as Lorraine pointed out, of that increased demand coming from fossil fuels. We're looking at a 35% increase in emissions. This is under a business as usual scenario. So those two pictures are a little bit at conflict with each other. And I would argue that the pervading piece in the middle there is that, yes, we're making lots of good, adopting targets, and that's really important, showing political will, showing signals, etc. But translating that into delivery mechanisms is hard. I mean, it's not happening as fast as it needs to, and which is the reason why we're seriously at risk of not meeting any of the targets that we've set for ourselves by 2030. And if I can pick on that, so there are many issues, financing, technology, etc. But if I can pick on one of the pervading issues that I think, cuts across everything, I would say it's a lack of capacity. I mean, it's easy to say, and everybody says it. Maybe I can illustrate it with an example. So I've been working with others in the Philippines on a program, ADB's first loan to support climate change policy in a country. And the Philippines is an excellent example. In fact, it's one of the countries in the region where the public discourse on climate change is very strong. There's no debate that climate is a serious issue. All of us who live in Manila know that, and elsewhere in the Philippines know that it's something we deal with on a day-to-day basis. The Philippines is one of the early movers on climate policy in the region, adopted a climate change act more than a decade ago. But at the same time, progress in the last 10 years has been slow in translating that policy into action, largely due to a lack of capacity, I would argue, at 4 different levels. One, at a kind of grassroots level across almost all stakeholders and local governments, there's a major lack of capacity to be able to identify climate interventions, though I would argue that's improving now, but then turn those into projects and get financing, access climate financing for those kind of projects, especially in local government. So that's at one level. There is a lack of capacity in the financial sector. So there's been really good policy in the last couple of years from the central bank promoting increasing take-up of climate in the context of financial regulation, in the context of disclosure, and encouraging banks to scale up green investment. But again, scale up across the banking sector has been slower because there is a pervading lack of capacity within banks, for example, to identify, to build these kind of investments to across companies to disclose. There is also a lack of capacity across sectors, I would say, or varying leadership. So the key sectors identified by the government here is energy, transport, agriculture, and natural resources. And basically, if you look across these these sectors, what you find is that some have really mainstream climate and have dedicated hubs and focals, etc., and others really haven't. So there's a major variation in sector leadership. And of course, at the fourth level, I would argue, for any country to promote quickly a transition to low carbon, they need a strong center on policy making and regulation related to climate. This kind of central institutional capacity is critical to continue to drive climate action, to bring all the sectors together to kind of keep pushing. And again, in the Philippines, there are good institutions, but there is a major lack of those institutions being supported, financed, and being capacitated and empowered to really be able to take on that role. So there's a capacity at issues across all levels, which I think then cascades into all the other issues, financing, technology, etc. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Naida. We'd like to hear from you, David.
Thanks, Henry. Just for background, I cover Indonesia and Malaysia, but I think I can also speak a little bit about Thailand and Vietnam. As a general rule, Indonesia has been lagging in building up renewable energy capacity in the last 3 to 4 years. In fact, if I can count the number of projects that have gone online in the last 3 to 4 years, I can probably just count as one solar project has been developed in the last 3 to 4 years. So the question is why? So the issues that we have right now is there's still a very heavy reliance on coal, not just coal-fired power plants, but also the supporting sectors, the coal mines and other sectors. And we're talking, a billion-dollar economy that is still very much, the middle of the force for the economy for Indonesia, as well as Vietnam, and I guess to a lesser extent Thailand. So that's issue number one. Number two, especially for Thailand and Indonesia, we are at overcapacity. The countries have been building up coal fired power plants for the last decade, and now they're all coming on stream, and they realize that the supply that's coming on stream is much greater than demand. So therefore, the need for renewable energy isn't that great, especially here in Indonesia. Other things, burning coal, I guess before coal went to $300, $400 per ton, it was quite cheap to burn coal, and you compare that to the intermittency of relatively expensive solar and wind that's coming on stream. So these are all kind of 3 or 4 kind of issues that are sort of stopping the growth of renewable in the sector. And one final point is when you're trying to replace coal with renewables, we're talking about scale here. So when you're talking about a coal-fired project, power project, we're talking 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4 gigawatts per project. And when you look at solar and wind, we can't build that scale so quickly. A big solar wind project might be 100 megawatts. So we're thinking we have to build 20 of those to just replace the coal. I'll stop there. Thank you, Henry.
Thank you very much, David. What I gather from the panelists' contributions so far is that there are technical challenges, yes, but also a lot of capacity and coordinating problems, so that technology can conceivably be solved in research, through research and development, but that the other part may be a bit more challenging. Someone has asked a question from the floor. Is there any interest in an inexpensive, high-level, fast-to-implement mitigation efforts? Marlon, would you care to respond to that?
I mean that mitigation efforts in terms of these have been implemented in across many markets, like all these renewable energy projects, right? For the Philippines, for example, we have built like 2,000 megawatts of new capacity since the renewable energy law was passed, and the new auctions that were done last 2 weeks ago, about a month ago, will provide has awarded 2,000 megawatts of new renewable energy. So I think that could fit into this fast deploy mitigation efforts for climate mitigation solutions. Otherwise, I can yield the floor to others for any suggestions. Those are the things that come on top of my head. Renewable energy in the Philippines, for example.
Anyone? Okay, the scale of the challenge is clearly vast. I can't help being reminded Albert Hirschman, the development pioneer, once said that for many development projects, it's actually good to underestimate the difficulty, because then otherwise you wouldn't get it done. And it's the discovery process of grappling with the difficulties that you discover that sort of contributes to its eventual success. Any thoughts on that? Anyone? Or, as Robert Browning also put it, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or else what is heaven for? Sometimes perhaps we should be ambitious. Okay, let's proceed to a next round of questions. For Marlon, Asia's phenomenal development adopted a grow first, worry about cleanup and equity later. But I guess this applies to all panelists. Has this perspective changed since COVID-19?
The critical thing here to consider is the gap between the ambition and what has been expressed and what has been done on the ground, like how has it been unfolding in terms of concrete things. So that's what we're trying to monitor post-COVID. There have been a lot of expressions of support towards concepts of building back better, green recovery, and all these ambitions towards adopting low carbon transformation as part of a post-COVID recovery. But we have yet to see that, and that's unfolding right now, especially given the geopolitical challenges, the economic challenges, as well as on-the-ground political realities for each country. So beyond ambitions and expressions of support towards this high-level concepts, it's really monitoring on-the-ground action that's critical. And otherwise, I'm eager to hear thoughts from other panelists.
Lorraine, any thoughts on the matter? Has there been a change in this perspective since COVID-19?
I think, I guess I would echo in a way what Marlon has said. I think there's been a declaratory change. I think the language that we hear is about building back better. It is about green recovery. And we find this coming from governments, from local authorities. We find it coming from regional organisations, and we find it at a global level. I think what we have not seen, and this applies not just to Southeast Asia, I should say, I think this is a global phenomenon. We have not seen a translation of that rhetoric into policy action. And I think this, part of our discussion today is to think about why is that the case? And I think there are, as a number of speakers have already identified, there are some very practical challenges, there are financial challenges, but I think there's a more normative challenge, is that we have governance structures and we have policy making mechanisms that are very much locked in the past, and we don't actually know how to do policy making and governance differently in a way that actually goes back to those green economy outcomes of not just environmental protection and resource efficiency, but also social equity and inclusion.
with regard to these capacity constraints that several of you have noted, many presenters, as Kumar has asked, many presenters have noted that there is a lack of human capacity to promote renewables and to mitigate climate risks. How is ADB contributing to address this issue? Can I address this to our ADB colleagues, Naida and Grace and David, perhaps? Naida, would you care to respond?
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, I can pick up on that. But if I may, if I also want to pick up on the earlier questions, those are interesting ones, and maybe just flag that. Yeah, since COVID-19, I would echo what Henry and Lauren, Marlon and Lauren have said, that there is a kind of change in narrative, but the issue is going beyond the narrative. But what I would argue is that we're actually at a really opportune time right now. We're still at the early end of this decade where we have to deliver a lot of things. We have a number of years within which we can make some changes, and in our region, a lot of the infrastructure that we need to deliver the SDGs is still yet to be built. So, I mean, if I pick up on Dan's question from the floor earlier on, like conversion of transport methodologies, yes, conversion of transport methodologies is expensive, but we still have a lot of transport infrastructure yet to build. So if we choose to go down the route of building a low carbon mode or investing more in that, and maybe it's not as, maybe it's not that slow or that hard to implement. It won't be difficult to implement a conversion later because we won't need to. So I would like to flag that the opportunity is still now to change the way that we are investing. So even if there's hopefully the narrative coming out of COVID, which has changed, it can help us to we can use that as an opportunity to kind of kickstart it. If I move on to the question from Kumar in the chat, I think ADB's everything that we do in the bank, I would argue, with our developing member countries does build in capacity to a certain extent. Whether it's through the loans that we support to build sector projects, particularly on the sovereign side, where we lend to governments, or whether it's through technical assistance that we give to build the systems around climate change planning. Again, if I can pick up on the example of the program that we're building for the Philippines, or that we built for the Philippines, we try to address capacity by targeting and kind of centralized budgeting systems within the country. So if there's better budgeting and allocation of financing for climate-related projects for particular ministries, it helps them to beef up their capacity. But we're also working with the the four key sector ministries to try and build those institutions and systems and level out the varying leadership across sectors. And that's just one example through a policy-based loan. But of course, through our investments and technical assistance, I think we build in capacity at multiple different levels. But I have to say that, having said that, this is a challenge and a change in governance systems and the way we govern, as Lorraine pointed out, that goes beyond what a single actor like ADB can influence.
Thank you, Naida. Let me pick up on your point about how there's going to be a big demand for transport infrastructure. And let me sort of expand on that. And this is to everyone in the panel. As the question is noted, Asia has had a stellar development record. In Southeast Asia, the middle classes are growing fast. They will be wanting their cars and their air cons, and they will be wanting to consume more beef and chicken, and they will be wanting to fly to Paris and Patagonia and Petra. What do you say to them about their growing needs conflicting with the need for reducing carbon emissions? Anyone? Yeah, Lorraine.
I suppose what I want to say is, I wonder if the two are necessarily mutually exclusive. So I guess there's 2 points I would want to make. One is, as we look at these kinds of issues and the growth of the middle class, my question is always, who gets left behind in that? So I think as we think about a green economy and transitions, which I don't think are necessarily incompatible with the idea of a growth of a middle class, but I think we always have to ask who gets left behind. So that's that question of distributional justice. And the second is, I think it's not so much about the kinds of choices, lifestyle choices that people make, but it's what options are available to them to make those lifestyle choices in a way that is that is in fact sustainable and low emission. I think it comes back a little bit to Naida's comment about technology and what we still have to build. One of the things I find disappointing is that globally, we've been talking about these sorts of things. I mean, I remember the Toronto conference in 1988 on climate change and atmospheric changes. So we've had 30 or 40 years to think about these kinds of things, and I find it really quite demoralizing to think that we're saying that we're still actually at the beginning of making these technological changes. Obviously, that's a situation we have to deal with, but I'm really interested to think about, well, how it goes back to one of the other questions. How can we make those changes more quickly than we have been in the past?
Anyone else?
Henry, if I may.
Yes, please.
I was thinking of your flying to Patagonia or Paris or Petra. I would say if it's low carbon fuels that we're including in our airplanes, then maybe so many of those flights wouldn't be a bad idea. But maybe it's not about maybe it's not only about a growing middle class being having to make a choice between living differently or not getting what previous generations or other parts the world have got. Maybe it's a different kind of choice. Maybe it's do you want to live in a world where there is a very good chance that my son will never really get to experience the coral reefs of Indonesia or Philippines because they won't be around in 10 or 12 years time, even if he could fly to Paris or Patagonia? Or do we want to live in a world where there are forest fires, as there where I am at the moment, or where there are continuous waves of COVID and other things? Is that the world we want to live in, or do we want to live in one which is somewhere in the middle? So I think it's not so much a choice of, and this comes up in the context of climate negotiations a lot, right? Climate justice and why should we be done out of what others have had, etc. But I don't think it's that choice anymore. Maybe that was the conversation 10 years ago, but now I'd say that it's not really a choice. Either we change the way that we live and manage whatever we need to within that, or we're dealing with a very different environment. That's my take.
One recent estimate, for instance, is that the net benefits of climate change mitigation efforts are so huge that the question I pose is in some sense moot. So, for instance, a paper by Bolton at Columbia University and Adrian estimates that reducing carbon emissions would realize a net gain of $78 trillion, or 1.2% of world GDP until, I think, 2040. Now, so potentially the benefits are so huge that, as I said, these questions may become are not that relevant anymore. Now, but to get to that, one constraint, as people have pointed out, is financing. Grace, any thoughts on the financing required for the transition?
Thanks, Henry. Actually, maybe we begin with the question that Kuma posted in the talk. So what has an ADB been doing? So as an international bank, basically we provide finance. And then actually there are different ways to provide finance. We can finance low carbon projects. We can finance transition, and then we can also trying to provide some seed fundings to leverage more private capitals, and then also build capacities for the the investors, and then also the companies to make environmental friendly investments. So starting from there, that we can see, for how financial sector can contribute to this transition. It's more about on the one hand, financial sector need more innovations to finance a better to finance more innovations, low carbon technologies, and then of course by providing a better risk sharing mechanisms to make it happen. So that is one task. The other is, on top of that, I think we do need a more infrastructure in the markets to make it happen. So there are a lot of awareness in the investment community to make a responsible investment. Well, this is already been found by different surveys worldwide. But what is really missing is consistent with what you just said, where there is a gap between awareness and what is really happening. This is observed both at the government level, at the household level, same in the community investment communities. So with this awareness, well, there are high proportion of this, financial institutions wanted to make ESG low carbon, this kind of investment, but in reality, they are not fully ready. This is not because, they don't want to. They lack the capacity, but more importantly, there is we still need a market to make it happen. So, for example, in terms of the information, so far there is still no way to help us to gather environmental emission related data from the projects accurately and cheaply. So this definitely block these fundings, and then on top of that, how to make sure that the investment is better aligned with these SDGs is still not clear. I mean, how these are properly aligned with each SDGs. There is still no clear guidance. And then on top of that, even so far, I mean, the standards and taxonomies are still not very consistent across countries. These are barriers in the market itself. And then on top of that, we don't know how to evaluate these kind of risks in the portfolio. So a lot of realities are there. And then ADB is really helping to de-risk these investments and then also helping to build the market itself.
Sure, given your interest in bonds, it may interest you to know that there's a recent paper that climate change actually could have an impact on sovereign debt, and they used it for the case of Italy. And this is related to Naida's point about how it would be important to mainstream climate risks into the budgetary process, so that right from the start you're able to monitor this, account for this. David, any views on financing?
I think in the past 5 to 10 years, there's been an explosion of availability of financing for green energy projects. The issues that we have here in this region, especially in Indonesia, is the lack of availability to finance those projects. So you have a lot of banks, including ADB from a long time ago, just refusing to finance coal. So basically the opportunity for coal is no longer there. So the problem that we have is really for the governments to be really enforcing their policies and really pushing the monopolies of the electricity generators to push those tenders out in wind and solar to bring them onto the market. Now, as I said before, the issues that we have is we have a very strong coal sector. For example, Indonesia is the biggest coal exporter and fifth biggest largest generator of coal assets in the world. So it's basically really weaning the entire sector of coal and then basically moving to renewable energies. But from a financing perspective, there are no issues, even to the point where ADB is willing to lend local rupiah financing for any kind of projects that have local revenues. I'll stop there. Thank you.
David, while I have you there, let me as well ask you this question about another key stakeholder. Climate change mitigation, the private sector, what's in it for them?
I think for the private sector, it's all about, the reputation. We're in a trend now where it's really cool to be, net zero. I mean, all these companies have all these net zero targets, and they really want to push that through their companies. So, for example, there's a project in Singapore where all of the Googles and the Facebooks, they want to make sure that all of the electricity is coming from green by, say, 2030, 2040. So they're willing to pay more for their electricity to ensure that they're actually using sustainable fuel sources for the electricity.
Someone had a question, Maria Norma Olga Asana, is ADB looking at ocean tidal energy? Would it be cost efficient and affordable? And following up from Lorraine's point earlier that solar and wind are still not well developed in the region, which seems surprising given that it's sunny and there's a lot of wind. What explains this? The infrastructure experts could probably answer those. David and Naida?
I think wind and solar in the region is definitely very strong. It's just wind and solar in Indonesia is particularly poor. I mean, we have a lot of land, we have a lot of sun. Again, it's all about the governments pushing the renewable energy agenda and putting those tenders out for more megawatts to be put on stream. Specifically on the tidal and ocean, at PSOD, we've seen quite a number of those ideas come through. The issue is lack of knowledge about the technology, and also can they be cost competitive against solar and wind? For example, a couple of years ago, some of the Middle Eastern sponsors put solar at 3.8 cents, a record low for Indonesia. Can tidal and ocean energy meet that? If it can't, then it's purely a price play, and Indonesia will not basically go for the more expensive product. I'll stop there.
Before I get to Marlon, who has raised his hand, Naida, would you care to add to that?
Not so much to that question. I think David covered it and in a lot more granularity than me. But if I can pick up on the financing point, but I could come back to it if Marlon wants to add now, and I can come back later.
Okay, Marlon. So Marlon, we'll turn to you first, and then we'll go back to Naida on financing.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, all right. So just to connect some of the questions earlier about awareness, right? There's significant awareness of the risks that climate poses, especially to the financial systems, and there's interest to capture opportunities and create products. But what we've seen is that we really need policy changes that could enable renewables to compete in a level playing field compared to the fossil fuel incumbents. So in the Philippines, for example, that would pertain to a policy change that remove automatic pass-throughs that artificially make fossil-based power sources cheaper compared to renewable energy. So because of their exposure to price fluctuations of their fuel, as well as to the forex fluctuations, they're able to pass through those costs to the consumers, making them artificially competitive. So if that is addressed, then there could be more ways by which renewable energy could be deployed. Of course, there were feed-in tariffs way before, and there are auctions and tenders being done, but that single change could allow more renewables to come in. And on the issue, and that's also applicable to Indonesia. If there are structural changes with the state monopoly PLN, that could allow for more massive scale up of renewable energy. And that connects to the question about the private sector. The World Resources Institute, WRI, is part of this coalition that convenes the RE100 companies. Those are the companies with 100% renewable energy and net zero targets, as well as different renewable energy sector industry associations. We have seen interest from corporates to really to source and supply 100% renewable energy in the region as part of their mandates. But this is presaged on renewable energy being accessible, affordable, and additional. So that means that beyond the finance system, the energy agencies will also have to be involved in the conversation towards low carbon transition. So both finance and energy agencies and government and public and private sector are working together on both sides. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlon. Naida, would you care to tell us more about financing? You're doing a lot on that right now.
Yes, like all my other colleagues here too. Yeah, so I think if I pick up maybe on what Grace mentioned earlier and how she laid it out, I would say maybe to really unlock the financing, everybody talks about this wall of capital that's there and all that stuff. So there's no issue with money. We have money if you look at the world. The question is, so many institutional investors with so many trillions in 90, 100 trillion in assets that are waiting to invest in emerging Asia. So there is that money. The question is, how do you unlock it? And in our region, I would say two sets of things. One on the kind of enabling environment side, and then one on the instrument side. So on enabling environment side, I think the core thing to unlock money is to use public money better. And that means starting from domestic budgets, building in climate into the way that we budget, ensuring that everybody all ministries and agencies, when they apply for funding, really allocate money for climate is really key. In order to do that, you need to have a system in place where the way you account and you build your budget integrates climate-related issues, climate-related activities, and climate-related risks. So in the context of the Philippines, the climate change expenditure tracking system, all very nuts and bolts and techie, but really important building block to be able to support better and stronger climate budgeting, to be able to support that the national government saying, okay, this year we've only allocated 6% of our national budget to climate-related stuff. Next year we need to increase that. But having those building blocks in place, like we do in the Philippines, is really key. The second aspect, I think, as Grace pointed out well, is when if you want to invest, even if you wanted to invest today in climate change beyond renewable energy, how would you pick where you are going to invest? And when you start looking at investing at a portfolio level or through a bond, again, how do you know that this one is really investing in a way that's going to support the transition? And in that context, there isn't enough data and information on emission reductions and impacts of our investments on some sectors, thresholds telling us whether this kind of transport project is good or bad. But a taxonomy cuts across a lot of that stuff and gives us an easy guide to be able to pick what's green and what isn't. And in that context, the ASEAN's work as a block on their taxonomy, it's taking a while, but actually, to be honest, it's been quicker than many other regions of the world. It's happening in phases, but it's a really good step forward because it's the region saying, we don't want to be held up to the EU taxonomy. We don't want to be, at the, we want to be able to come up with a standard for what's green and what isn't, based on what's relevant and what's real for our situation. So the work of the ASEAN taxonomy, last year there was an initial report. There's now more work in more depth to come up with thresholds by sectors, will give us a standard to be able to more easily say across 80% of the types of investments that we're seeing or that we want to push for, this really will support a transition and some of this won't. So that's kind of really critical on the enabling environment side. And then on the instrument side, because you mentioned it as well, I think what we've seen across COVID is that supporting the development of capital markets and supporting the ability, the diversification of the types of instruments in capital markets to include more green and climate bonds it has remained relatively strong. I mean, all other sources and types of financing were largely affected by the pandemic. Bonds have gone from strength to strength, especially in Southeast Asia. And I'd pick on the example of Thailand's COVID recovery bond, which is also a green bond in supporting the expansion of the MRT system in Bangkok. The bond has raised 5.6 billion in multiple taps. Philippines did a sovereign bond issuance this year, which again has raised, 1.5 billion or something like this in green bonds from both the Japanese, the samurai market, but also more broadly in US dollars. So actually, bonds have shown that they could be a solid source of financing. The real question is, how do we make sure that those happen at a subnational level and those happen across all countries, not just the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand of the region. And lastly, I would pick on coming back to the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. ADB has been looking at different ways for a number of years of de-risking investments and leveraging public finance better. I work on something called the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, which is a catalytic vehicle where we have $2 billion or so of public money, and we try to use it to leverage and mobilize more funds for individual green projects. We focus on the sovereign side of the investment spectrum. But what I would say is that these types of vehicles, whether regional or national, in fact, maybe more national, are really critical to be able to pool capital, deploy them for a series of investments where you've clearly identified what a green investment looks like. And at the national level, I'd say they're even more important because they help to provide scale to a lot of small projects. So like Henry, of the SDG Indonesia One project in Indonesia, it's one of ADB's projects, where we are providing a loan to the government, 150 million, and we're using that to scale up financing across many small projects, which we, ADB, would not invest in individually because they'd be too small for us to get involved in. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Let me follow up on that. There's been a lot of discussion on bond financing of decarbonization and climate change mitigation. In some ways, these ventures are like venture capital, and venture capital tends not to be financed with loans or bonds. Why is it, or is that a promising avenue for decarbonization financing?
Can I go first? But maybe I'll also ask my fellow speakers. I would say that I don't agree that all of low carbon development is like venture or requires venture capital kind of financing. I think there's a ton of it that does, especially in the marine space, for example, blue options and solutions. We still need venture cap to come in. But for a lot of what we're talking about, low carbon is stuff that's been around for a long time, large scale renewables, low carbon transport, train systems. This doesn't require venture capital, and it's perfectly suitable with the longer term and more stable revenues if those exist for some of those projects to mobilize bond investments. The real question is, do you have those kind of vehicles? Are there systems in place for sovereigns or corporates to be able to track and show the use of proceeds of green and climate bonds to really those kind of projects? Maybe we aren't seeing enough project bonds, and we certainly aren't seeing enough or any sub-sovereign bonds, city level. That's going to be really key and critical going forward, because that will unlock the financing. So we're not seeing that yet, but I'd say I would say it actually suits it quite well for most of what we need for the low carbon transition.
Let me move on. We've talked a lot about financing and planning, but it's also important that these decisions are structured so that they're engaged with local communities. And so that, as Lorraine has noted, the marginalized and vulnerable sectors are not jeopardized by these efforts. Could you expand on that, Lorraine? How can we ensure that these efforts do not lead to negative consequences for these sectors?
Thank you, Henry. I think, as most of the other panelists have partly identified either explicitly or implicitly, in some ways it's actually very difficult to guarantee particular kinds of outcome. I'm taken particularly the fact that Naida has suggested or talked about changing the way that we invest. But there's a question, isn't there, about what are we investing in? And we've discussed, I think thus far, really focusing on renewable energy. Let's talk about energy. We've been talking about renewable energy projects. It may be projects also in transportation, even in aviation, in agriculture, in a range of other sectors where sometimes it's clearer. In some of those sectors, it's much clearer what it means to do low carbon economic activity. One of the other points I might just pick up on, though, is I think we were talking a little bit earlier about how the private sector understands costs. And one of the issues, and those of you at the ADB will know this much better than I, is what technical skills and capacities do we have to actually fully cost investment and outcomes. So when we talk about costs, how do we take account of the cost of ecosystem services, for example? If we're talking about nature-based solutions, how do we actually do natural capital accounting? So that's just picking up on some of the observations that people have already made. The issue about investment should also be looking at investment in social infrastructure, and that's particularly important, I think, in the concept of a green recovery in a COVID context. So this is about investment in strengthening social protection systems, health and education systems. One of the complexities of that is this just simply public money, or are there ways of leveraging other kinds of investment? So that's the first thing. But Henry, to go to your specific question about what does it mean to involve local communities, and particularly those who are marginalised in both rural and urban areas. I suppose the first thing is, well, why would that be important? One, it's important because green growth and green economies and decarbonisation processes are about being equitable and socially inclusive. Green economy investment decisions can actually have negative justice and equity consequences for local communities, for households, for individuals. And I think we've talked partly about what those are. So that's sort of the negative dimension. But the positive dimension is that good investment decisions can also empower and support people and communities as they redeploy, as they build new capacities and capabilities to participate in and benefit from a new low carbon economy. So there are both push and pull factors, if you like. studies in places like the studies in Indonesia, Laos, PGR, Vietnam, have nevertheless shown that community engagement in, say, energy transitions doesn't automatically lead to fairer outcomes or the involvement of those who are most marginalised. If the interventions only include and bring advantages to those that are already in socially and economically privileged positions. So often there's a gender dimension to this, but there's also often the elderly, those who are disabled, or a range of other social situations that people might be in, those who are facing health burdens and diseases, for example. I think the question is how do we do this? How do we make sure? So we know why it's important. How do we make sure that it happens? First, there's actually, well, do we have the tools to evaluate investment in both projects and outcomes for compliance with those broader principles of just transitions? We know what those principles are: distributional, participatory, procedural, and recognition. What kinds of toolkits do we have to make sure that we do those kinds of assessments and evaluations? And I think Naida has touched on some of the development work that's being done in the region. Those sorts of participatory or inclusive models also require much better informational disclosure, more effective space for public and local communities to provide input into project planning. How do we make sure that when an investment decision is made, and it's often made, let's say in a boardroom or a corporate space, or a government space or a local government authority, what does the toolkit look like to embed those sorts of informational disclosure and participatory spaces into those decisions, rather than having a decision made purely on financial and economic terms, and then afterwards saying, oh, how do we make this happen now? My suggestion is it needs to be much more strongly embedded in the decision-making process. It also means that that's about identifying, well, who constitutes a local community? How do we take account of gender dimensions? How do we take account of those who work fundamentally in the informal economy, and who we might not identify as having a particular role in those sorts of inputs and participatory spaces?
Thank you for that, Lorraine. So as I gather, Naida was saying that climate risk issues should be mainstreamed right at the start in fiscal programming. What you're saying is that the social impact should be into the climate risk, programs and projects right at the start. Let me pick up consultation and participation. David, someone asked, Annalisa de Guzman, how can the private sector influence local governments to invest more in renewables?
Actually, essentially, the role in private sector is not really to influence governments. I mean, we can tell them that we'll support a certain sector, but I would have thought it'd be more through results-based lending from the sovereign guys to be supporting the government, saying, if you can produce X gigawatts of renewable energy over the next 3-4 years, we can give you an X billion-dollar loan to support it in that sense. That's really where the sovereign comes in for human capital, technological capital for the government to spend that. For us, really, our job is to be there, that when available projects come online, that we support the private sector as best as we can.
Marlon, anything to add to that?
Yes, thanks, Henry. So from my viewpoint, the private sector could really relay and amplify their demand for sound government policies, so that they could invest more, and so that they could procure. One of the biggest challenges among private sector players, especially corporate, commercial, and industrial end users, is that they are unable to procure clean energy in many markets. We've seen that in Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, and unless specific policies that allow them to procure on-site and off-site renewable energy in place, are in place, then they'll not be able to achieve their corporate ambitions of 100% renewable energy or net zero targets. So the private sector needs to be loud in terms of saying that they need government policies for them to be able to do so. And this is a way of amplifying their demand to raise ambitions, to set the regulatory framework, because these interventions will be mutually beneficial for both private sector and the government, especially in the context of NDCs.
Policies, let me pick up on that. Greenhouse gas emissions are underpriced. One way to reduce them is to raise their price. But as someone noted in the comments board, higher fuel prices again? Anyone care to react to that reaction? Can't make an omelette without breaking eggs.
Yes, or maybe it's short term versus long term, I suppose. As with everything, when you're ripping off the band-aid, right? I mean, it's in the short term, yes, it is. Fuel prices are a key issue, and in the context of the current geopolitical movements, the volatility of fuel prices again is a pain for everyone, and a pain we all feel daily. On the other hand, it also acts, I suppose, in the medium term as an incentive to move away and divest from these kind of technologies. I mean, buy a hybrid car, not a fully petrol one. The next time you're investing, it makes more sense in the future. And at an economy level, I think the current fuel crisis issues we're seeing this year really highlight that our region is particularly vulnerable in terms of fuel security, energy security. We really haven't divested away enough. We're still so heavily dependent on oil imports and things like this that we're really facing it in a painful way. So if anything, hopefully the current short-term crisis can push us to really, in the medium and long term, make the structural changes needed. But if I can also, Henry, go back to the point earlier on, which is a really good point on the private sector. I would say, picking up on what David himself mentioned a while ago, which was, the reason that the big banks like ADB, but not ADB only, I would say the big private banks, the HSBCs, the cities, etc. of this world, have divested away from coal a few years ago, and that itself served as a major signal, I would say, to government. So it's kind of push and pull. I mean, in fact, I would argue today a lot of coal-fired power generation is still being supported by export credits and heavily supported by public financing, because there is no more private financing, or not much of it available anymore for those kind of power projects. And I would say, coming out of COP21 in 2015, that was the major push. It was the private sector that was shouting from the rooftops that we're not going to invest in this anymore, and that almost worked as a kind of signal for some of the governments in our region who moved a few years later that, oh wow, there's no more money on this anymore. So we need to change, and it's obviously a serious thing that people are talking about across global markets. So I think that the private sector's amplification role, as Marlon pointed out, is really key.
Shu, you had raised your hand.
Yeah, I would like to add to what Naid just said about this price issues. So basically, very briefly, I agree with Naid's point. So basically, especially when we face the rising oil price these days, and then I think we can also view it in a more positive way. So it also shows the significance, the significance of having alternative energy sources, and then also it might be an opportunity because it makes the renewable solutions relatively cheaper. I mean, given the price increase. And then on top of that, I also agreed with Naid. So basically, it is more in the midterm and long term, and then particularly when the renewable solutions, when they are really rolling out and we have a scale, the price will drop quickly. So I mean, after the initial pain period, and then I think they will eventually become competitive. And then at the same time, we also need to foster more technology advances to make it cheaper and then to make it easy to adopt. Thanks.
That's like when we accidentally started doing WFH, it turned out there were lots of better ways to do what we were doing, right? Samir Katiwada has a comment. The green transition will require certain jobs being lost, certain jobs being created, and transitioning from the disappeared jobs to the new jobs. This transition could be long, and it will require adjustments, investments in education and skills development, as well as public employment services. We are in our last 15 minutes. I strongly encourage the audience to please type your questions or raise your hands. A question from Estela Tansenko Shapiro. How can the private sector invest in transitioning from coal, given investment restrictions? Anyone? Ms. Shapiro, what investment restrictions do you have in mind? Or our experts here may know. How can the private sector invest? Yes, Marlon.
Yeah, I can chime in. So there has been significant investments already that has been added over the past decade on renewable energy across different technologies, solar, wind, even geothermal and hydro. So the private sector has been a huge participant and contributor to this ongoing transition, helped by and because of supporting and informing this transition, this has been helped by the massive declines in prices of the technologies, right? We've seen for across solar and wind, compared to a decade ago, prices have dropped anywhere from 80 to 85%. We're seeing as well for battery energy storage, around 60 to 80% in terms of a drop in prices. So the private sector has been a contributor and a participant in the ongoing transition. The question is how does it do so at a speed and scale needed to achieve our shared climate targets? And that is where, amplifying their demand, making sure they cooperate and collaborate together across several platforms, and being like, I guess, the voice so that we also avoid lock-in to other fossil infrastructure, because we've seen post-coal, there is a threat towards a lock-in to gas infrastructure, which will have to be carefully managed. That will be the next avenue for the private sector to really participate in and contribute its efforts on to avoid lock-in that does not give us that doesn't address our energy challenges, that does not contribute to society and address our environment and climate needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlon. Lorraine, you had something to add.
Partly to pick up on the comment that was made, or the question that was made also about as we transition from, for example, coal and other fossil fuels energies into renewables, about job losses. And I think probably most people are familiar with the work. I mean, it appears under the auspices of the Paris Agreement, the International Labour Organization extensively working on the concept of just transitions as a labour-related concept about decent work. And so there are strategies very well in place for thinking about how we identify where retraining might be needed, where particular kinds of social protection mechanisms might be needed, support for workers who may be in a position where retraining is difficult. So those strategies are actually very well developed, and there are some good experiences in other parts of the world. So there are toolkits available for doing that. In terms of the private sector, I mean, this is where the private sector actually is really absolutely crucial. And they have a first mover advantage as well. Those companies that can actually take these steps and to do this quickly, whether it's about their own particular industries or whether it's about how they invest, are actually likely to see a better return on their investment than those who actually delay. And we have examples from other environment-related sectors as well. There's also historically, of course, some very interesting work on the way in which the private sector has responded to incentives or actually led the debates. I'm thinking, for example, about the whole debates around ozone depletion, and we're going back now into the 1970s, for example, where we know that the key companies and the chemical producing companies were already working on replacement technologies, and as soon as those replacement technologies became available and ready for the market, that's when those companies came out and supported very, very strongly, sometimes changing within a space of a few months, intergovernmental action on something like ozone depletion and how we could restrict that. So I think we can also look historically and see, well, where else has this worked? We can look at the Mercury negotiations, for example, and see how the private sector took a role in that. So I think we have historical examples about the way in which incentive structures have actually encouraged private sector action and private sector investment.
Grace, we'd like to hear for your 2 minutes contribution, and then we wrap up.
Okay. I would like to briefly add to Stella's question, and then I also echo Naida and Martin. So basically, how private sector will invest in transition. I mean, I think just as Henry just mentioned, I mean, we need a small, well, some part of venture capital to invest in technologies. I think Ray also mentioned, well, some new technologies, some biocoals. That is one solution. We need huge scale of capital to scale up existing solutions, which via banking sector and then via bond market. So that is the major financing comes from. But I think what Stella really means is how to transit. I mean, how we finance the transition itself when we already have many high emitting industries. For example, coal-firing power. This is where I see which is currently missing or still needs more discussion in terms of the financial sector chain. So we have innovation, we have VC, we have large scale of scaling up of existing technologies by supporting solar and renewable energy solutions, wind. But so far we have this concept transition finance. So they are supposed to help those brown industries to adopt to low carbon solutions. But that's where I think the entire market still need more efforts on, because many of the investors, they are quite concerned about investing this because it's not very clear. Are these still brown or green, and then how do they report their risk, because everything is not clear. So far, the only solution, I think, part of the solution is using sustainability linked bonds, but that is still, I mean, the size is relatively small, much smaller compared to green bonds. And then the transition bonds itself is also very, very limited. So I think that is where financial sector development can further develop to finance the transition or develop transition finance itself.
Thank you, Grace. We are nearing the end of our policy talk. So climate change, mitigation, decarbonization, potentially huge benefits, but also difficulties with financing, capacity, social implications, technological current limitations. But potential solutions also keep coming up, are being debated, are being considered, being experimented with, as our expert panel has just discussed. So to end, I would like to ask each of you for your closing thoughts, closing remarks. 1 to 2 minutes, please. Let's start with David.
Thanks, Henry. I think to summarize, specifically for Indonesia and other parts of the region, there needs to be less reliance on coal. I mean, that's a lot easier said than done. There needs to be a stronger policy from the government to push the renewable energy sector, whether it's feed-in tariff or tax solutions, because the financing is there. ADB and a number of commercial banks and other DFIs are willing to spend a lot of money. I mean, we have big targets to increase our green financing in the next 10 years, so it's definitely there. So it's all really a matter of the governments to work with the commercial and private sector to find the policies to make it fair and equitable to transition from a coal to a green economy. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Marlon?
Thank you, Henry. One of the biggest insights that I gathered from this conversation came from Nida, reminding us that in this decisive decade of action, we are still in the second year, and we have this whole opportunity within this decade to achieve what we need to achieve in terms of our shared decarbonization goals, the low carbon transition, to make this just, inclusive, and opportunity creating for many people. One of the comments in the chat is about the MSMEs. They need to be part of this and benefit from the low carbon transition. Again, I go back to my earlier statement. In this decisive decade of action, we have this generational opportunity to transform our energy systems, our transport systems, as well as our behavior. It is good to imagine what will this be? A decarbonized, a decentralized, and digitalized energy system that benefits nature, people, and planet. So thank you.
Thank you, Marlon. Nahida?
Thanks, Henry. Marlon basically took my point, which is just going to be my closing point. But okay, so I'll have to make another one. But if I have to start with, okay, three kind of takeaways, stuff that we've heard, maybe stuff that I haven't heard today. Well, first is going back to the question from Phuong in Vietnam about MSMEs. So I think using financing well, using public financing in a smarter way is going to be a key tool for us to be able to make the changes, especially at government level, as we've all pointed out today. Governments, governance, policy making, capacity, those are areas we really need to work on if we want to unlock quickly. So using financing well is one important tool that we as a development bank, other development partners, governments can use. Develop the right kind of incentive structures, so especially in the case of SMEs, for example, and you've seen in Thailand before, ADB is working in Cambodia now. You can use innovative financing mechanism, revolving funds, cheaper loans tied to particular outputs to really push and enable SMEs to quickly invest in changing technology and converting technology. So I think that kind of work is going to be critical across the region, using financing well and more innovatively. Second point that is a point that we haven't heard or talked a lot about today is the whole area of emissions related to land use change. So we've talked a lot about the energy sector, decarbonization of the energy sector, transport sector, etc. But the reality is in our region, the elephant in the room is not an elephant at all. It's lots and lots of deforestation and loss of natural forests. Even if we manage to decarbonize our entire energy system, we're still going to be a net emitter because 40% across, more than half in Indonesia is coming from deforestation and forest degradation, and that is a much harder puzzle to solve. I would argue, compared to energy, it's as difficult, as politically contentious as energy, and we're not talking about it at all, or not enough. So that's a worry, and we need to talk about it more. And lastly, I would again echo what Marlon, I argue that he took my point, but anyway, which was that there is still the opportunity, right? And especially the injection of money that we are seeing from governments on COVID recovery. Let's use it better, and let's really try and change the way that we invest, or the way that we encourage our governments to invest in these regions. If it's a choice between how we're building our logistics system, how we're building our transport systems, how we're building the way we're building our buildings, how much energy they use, let's make those choices as best as we can now. Thank you.
Let's hear from Grace.
Thanks. I just briefly add to what others has already said. Since the public sector actually plays a very critical role to guide the whole economy towards this low carbon transition by guiding private sector investments, and then by fostering the behavior change, and then also fostering innovation. So my key point is, the government still faces, funding constraints, resource limits, and then also capacity capacity to develop policies. I think ADB might wish to foster the government's capacity to develop, I mean, a more integrated policy, so that there should be some coordination between different government sectors, so that we can make a more concrete and consistent action plans to leverage and then push the low carbon transition.
Thank you, Grace. Before I give the last word to Lorraine, and professors always get the last word, I would thank you everyone for attending this, and we hope you will attend future sessions. And now let's turn to Lorraine.
Thank you very much, Henry. I wasn't aware that professors always got the last word. I must remind people of that. Thank you. Can I say firstly, thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I've learned a great deal and I've really enjoyed it. A couple of observations. One, in all of our discussions about green economies, we should not lose sight of the importance of valuing ecosystem services and looking for nature-based solutions and natural capital accounting. That's the first. The second observation is that questions of justice have to be at the heart of any discussion on green economy, green recovery, and transitions to low carbon growth. So that's mainstreaming that into our discussions about capacity, about technology, about finance, about regulatory frameworks, and to continue to work on developing the toolkit that enables us to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you to all our expert panelists for your insights, your contributions, and we hope you will continue doing so in this and other venues. Thank you, everyone. We hope you have a good day, a good weekend, and we are looking forward to meeting you again in future editions of the Southeast Asia Policy Talk series.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.